Well, the maker of popular video game Fortnite won a court battle against Google. Epic Games sued Google back in 2020 and accused the company of unlawfully making its app store dominant over rivals. For more on what kind of implications this could have for Apple and its app store, we're joined by Angelo Zino. He's a senior equity analyst with CFRA Research. Angelo, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Great. Thanks for having me, Jacqueline.
So this is really interesting because Apple has already been in a court fight with Epic Games, and Apple actually won on that side. But could this still have implications for Apple?
Well, I mean, theoretically, yes. I mean, it's definitely kind of a different type of situation here. I mean, to your point, Apple, did have to face Epic in the courts, and largely they did win and prevail. But when you kind of look at what Alphabet, had to go through here, I mean, clearly a slap in the face to them. But I mean, the courts essentially found that, they did utilize monopolistic powers to kind of gain an edge out there or an advantage. And when you kind of think about here, what the implication is for Apple, I'd say at the end of the day, I think what most most investors are worried about, at least as far as kind of the App Store story is for Apple, it's kind of all about that fee structure, the ability to kind of sustain, that 30% fee structure. And our view is longer term, that's probably not sustainable. But Apple's going to do everything they can to sustain that fee structure as long as possible, and they'll probably have to go region by region and kind of fight that over time. But ultimately, they will likely have to kind of reduce that fee structure. We think at some point down to 15%. But when you actually think about the impact it has on a top line perspective, that's probably about 300 to 400 basis points of a negative impact. More of an impact to the bottom line, of course, because it is a higher margin business, and probably a bigger impact to the stock if and eventually when it does happen. But if it ends up happening kind of slowly over time through different geographic regions, Apple will definitely be able to kind of weather that storm.
Yeah, and I guess that sort of answers this, but I was curious about just, how big the App Store is to Apple, in terms of that sort of category for the company.
Yeah, so I mean, you think about their services business, it's now north of 20% of their revenue in terms of the run rate. But, again, clearly a much bigger representation in terms of the profitability, because you're talking about services being north of 70% margins, whereas kind of their product side of things is kind of mid-high 30s. Type margins. So, when you think about kind of what the App Store is in terms of the services business, let's call it about 30 to 35%, at most. There is an impact there, but it's something we think Apple will be able to kind of weather as long as it doesn't kind of happen in one, full swoon across kind of, on a global perspective.
One of Bloomberg's reporters was had a report out earlier this month talking about how the company is reportedly readying some new iPads and MacBooks to really switch up the lineup and try to boost sales. And I wonder what you think of the potential of that.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think when you think about the iPad business, it is less than 10% of the total revenue. But I think when we look at Apple's approach here in terms of iPads, I think anytime you can kind of improve kind of the structure and kind of how they kind of sell that that offering to the consumer, I think that's always a good thing. I think it helps kind of the pricing structure out there and how Apple intends to kind of tackle that market. I mean, clearly, when you think about what Apple is doing on the Mac side of things in terms of what they're doing in phones, and also what we think they're eventually going to do with the Vision Pro. I mean, the Pro devices are clearly going to kind of be at the high end of the market. That's kind of the clear point Apple wants to make with their iPads, followed by the Air on the mid side of things, and then of course they have their more traditional type of iPads out there. So I think it's a good move out there. I don't necessarily expect the iPad to kind of be this huge growth driver for the company kind of looking forward. But as we kind of go to the June quarter and September quarters next year, they start lapping very easy comparisons. So we do expect them to kind of return to growth as they launch those kind of next gen products with the M2 Gen 3 chip out there as you kind of, let's say, go to those June and September quarters.
Yeah, I wish that Vision Pro wasn't going to be so expensive. I think it's $3,500 US. It looks really interesting. Like, I'd love to just play around with it. But yeah, it really does come with quite the price tag. When you look at some of the other VR headsets in the hundreds of dollars range, it is quite the gap. Do you think that the future for Apple and its VR it includes getting the prices down to a more accessible level, or do you think it's always going to be sort of a niche, more of a exclusive product?
So listen, I think relative to the rest of the market, it's always going to kind of be a premium type device, similar to what the approach is with their phones and Macs and what have you. But will that kind of 35 price tag be their ultimate end device? Probably not. I mean, we do think they kind of get down to $2,500 and likely below there, towards that $1,500 price point, which we think will be a price point that could get some consumers out there to really kind of start buying in kind of mass. In the masses. So over time, the price point will come down. We do think over the next 2 to 3 years, you see kind of more pro vision devices out there. But at this point in time, yeah, it's not something we're kind of baking in terms of our wearables kind of forecast out there.
What do you think are some of the potentially more influential drivers for Apple in the year ahead, Angelo?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think a story that's very neglected on Apple's side of things is really kind of that gross margin story. You kind of look over the last couple of years, over the last 5 years, we've been able to get the gross margins from about 38% to 45%. When you kind of look at where the street's at, they're kind of flatlining a 45% margin here over the next couple of years. We think there's a lot of upside to that margin expectation out there. A lot of that has to do with what they're doing on the R&D side of things. If you look at R&D, their R&D expenses are up about 35% over the last 2 years, more than doubled over the last 5 years. They're actually increasing R&D expenses faster than Microsoft is. So a lot of that is going towards kind of improving the gross margin profile through kind of internally developing a lot of those chips, but it's also kind of reinvesting towards a lot of the new growth initiatives on both the hardware and the services side of things. We do think Gen AI is going to be a big story for Apple in calendar 2024. Has been largely a black box thus far, but I think the developers conference in June next year will kind of give us some hints to what Apple has been working on. And again, a lot of that big step up on the R&D side of things, probably getting leverage on the Gen AI side of things.
Okay.